Hey guys, it's Courtney. Today I'm going to be using the Fresh Cut Flower stamp set by My Favorite Things. I showed you that other sentiment set, but we're not going to end up using that. So I'm starting off with a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock. This is already pre-cut to 5.5 by 4 1/4. And I'm using my Misty here because I'm going to be stamping this a few times with Fade Out ink by Ink on 3. We're going to do some no-line coloring, but we're going to kind of make it mimic watercoloring, if that makes sense. So I want to make sure that you guys can see the lines and I can see the lines very good. So I stamped this 3 times. That way it's very visible, but this ink does kind of do exactly what the name of it says, is it kind of fades away as you color. So I ended up trimming down my panel just a little bit, and this ended up being 5 1/4 by 4, just a little bit smaller than my A2 size card. And I'm going to start by outlining everything. I'm going to go right in with my W5, which is the darkest color. And as I'm outlining, I'm not going right up to the line. Because I know I'm going to have some bleeding, I want to allow myself a little bit of room so that if it does bleed, it doesn't bleed too much onto the image itself. The beauty about no line coloring is that you can change the shape of any object that you're coloring. You can make it bigger or smaller, or change the shape of it if needed. So I want to, as much as I can, eliminate bleeding, but if I have a little bit, it's okay because I can kind of change the shape of anything that I'm coloring. So like I said, I'm just going to go ahead and continue to outline everything with my darkest color. And you can see that I have the marker pretty much straight up and down. I am using pretty much the tip, a little bit on the side for the larger areas where I want to extend this out a little bit. But there's also some gaps between the flowers right there in the center. So I'm going to fill those in too, and you can see that I'm just using the tip here. Next, I'm going to go in with the W3, and I have this sped up because this is not something you'd want to watch 15 minutes of. So I'm going to go right directly over that W5 and extend that out a little bit with the W3. So whenever you go over a darker color, especially multiple times like I am with a lighter color, you're going to kind of move that color. You're not going to eliminate it, but you're going to kind of move it around. And I want that because I want it to kind of look watercolor-ish. So I'm okay with it moving around, which is another reason why we allowed some space between where we put that W5 and where the image began, because it will bleed. That color will move, especially now that we're bringing in the W1. So I'm going to go right directly over the W5 and the W3, and it's going to kind of look kind of like a blurry kind of look. You're not going to get like a perfect blend like you normally go for, but that is what I want for my background. I want it to be a little bit blurry and kind of blobby looking, I guess. So I'm extending all of those areas out, and I'm also filling in the rest of the card panel with this W1. Now you can see, hopefully on camera, where my colors are starting to bleed a little bit and getting a little bit closer to where the image is actually stamped, which is kind of what I anticipated, which is why I allowed myself a little bit of room. Other areas didn't bleed, and that's okay too. Being I'm doing no line coloring, I can just make those little areas or petals or leaves just a little bit larger. So once I have all of the background done, I'm going to take my refill here from my colorless blender, and I'm just squeezing out a few drops into a dish, and I'm going to use a very small paintbrush, and this is a cheapy one. Like, these are like 5 for $1 in the craft store, and I'm going to flick on that colorless blender just like you would water with watercolor or on distress ink in the background. And this is going to remove that color or kind of move it around like water would with distress ink or watercolor. It's kind of hard to see on camera now, but once everything is said and done, hopefully in the final photos, you'll be able to see that. You want to make sure the panel is completely dry, which only takes a minute or so. If it's not cool to the touch, then it's dry. Next, we're going to go on to the actual coloring itself. I'm going to start off with the center of this flower just so that I don't lose it. And I'm pretty much just putting in small little dots here and then making those dots a little bit larger with my mid-tone color. And then I'll bring in my lightest color and kind of fill in that entire center of the flower. And this is only because I don't want to lose this area or mistake it for a petal while I'm doing my coloring. No line coloring, I do one petal at a time so that I don't lose track of what I'm doing. So I'm going to start off with my lightest color here, and this first petal, all I did was kind of map out where my darkest areas will be, and then I'll go in with my darkest color to add those darkest areas, which will basically be where this petal is kind of laying underneath another, and from the base of the petal, extending that out with the two midtones, and then I'll go back to my lightest color for just a very small highlight on the tip of the petal. Now, once I get this petal done, I realize that I probably don't need to necessarily map out my darkest areas, especially for the smaller petals. I decided to just completely fill them in. And you can always go back, like this one, you can always go back and add a little bit more dark. I wanted it to be a little bit darker than that, so I just went in with my darkest midtone and added that a little more in. Now, you can kind of see that I have some ink kind of pooling on the petal because I'm adding so much of it. I'm doing that on purpose. You'll get that anyway, especially if your markers are really full, but I'm doing that. I'm coloring the flowers just like I did the background. I'm going over those darkest areas with my lightest color to kind of make that muddy kind of look, or watercolor kind of look, actually. So I'm just going to go ahead and continue on here. I'm just going to show you this particular flower, and then I'll color the other flowers off camera. For this petal, this one is kind of folded over on itself, so I'm creating a shadow where it is folded. And then for the fold part itself, I'm just going to go in with the lightest color because that would naturally be raised up a little bit more than the rest of the petal, so it would appear to be lighter. So I'm going to continue to go around the entire flower here, pretty much doing the same thing, covering it in one petal at a time with the lightest color, then the darkest areas, two midtones, then back to the lightest color. I'm going to speed things up a little bit here, but just so that you can kind of see for all of the different shaped petals that you may come across, how I colored them and where I put my shading. I did want to mention to you guys while you're watching this coloring that I will be in Syracuse this coming week. It will be the 15th, 16th, and 17th with one of my friends, Jen, who you guys probably know. It's Scrappina Creations. And we are meeting in Syracuse for a few days just to kind of get together and craft together. But we want to do a live. So we are going to do a live on the 16th. I'm not sure what time it'll be. It'll probably be around 8 or 9 o'clock Eastern time. That way it'll hopefully be a good time for everybody. And we're just going to kind of chat. We're not going to really create anything unless you guys want us to. But we get a lot of questions both on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook. Sometimes we get emails with a lot of just general questions about what products we like, why we like them, what products we don't like, how we started YouTube and why. People who are interested in starting YouTube channels, where do they begin? All different kinds of questions. And I love to answer them. So maybe people who don't know how to reach out to us or don't want to necessarily reach out to us who have some questions, we're certainly going to be available for you guys to ask. If you're not able to join the live, you can certainly leave a comment below with anything that you want us to discuss. I know there's a lot of questions about design team stuff too, how to get on one, what's it all about, things like that too. So any question at all that you guys have for either me, Jen, or both of us, and you're not able to join us, feel free to leave it in the comments and I'll kind of make a list of the questions that have been asked so that we can make sure that we address them, and then you can always watch it back on replay. So as you can see, I'm kind of getting towards the end of this petal here, and sometimes when I get towards the end, I kind of lose where I am. What are the remaining petals and what direction are they facing and things like that. So it's helpful to actually look at the image as a whole with bold black outlines versus the no line. So I'm going to take a scrap piece of paper. I still have my stamp and my Misty. I'm going to stamp this with some black ink, and I'm just going to have this off to the side, and I'll use this as a reference. If at all I get lost or I'm not sure what I'm coloring, especially with those areas where our W markers kind of bled a little bit, it may be hard to tell. So I'll continue to use this as a guide for the remainder of my coloring. So I'm going to go ahead and color the little buds and the other flowers off camera, and then we'll move on to the leaves and the stems. Now, this got a little bit tricky as well because there's some teeny tiny areas right up on top where we're going to start with. And I didn't necessarily fill in enough of the gray because I was too afraid that I was going to completely cover up the image, which would have been fine because with no line, you can certainly alter any image. So I'm going to go in with my lightest green, and I'm just kind of using the black outline that we stamped as my guide to lightly draw in my stems, my leaves, and kind of like the base of the flowers, whatever part that is, where the leaves come up on the bud part, whatever. You guys know what I'm talking about. And then I'm going to go add a little bit of shading, and this is actually my darkest mid-tone. I didn't want to go in with my very darkest color because these are super, super teeny tiny areas, and it would be too hard to get rid of if I made a mistake. So I'm just adding a little bit of shading on the base of the little leaves that are kind of scattered throughout. And for the most part, I kept the stem just one color because the stem is so tiny in this particular area. But once I had all of that filled in, I was able to kind of see where those gaps were, where my W markers didn't necessarily bleed as much as I thought they would be in this area. So I can go ahead and take one of my W markers, and I took the mid-tone. I took the W3 because I was too afraid to go in with the W5, and just filled in those little gaps to make it blend in with the rest of the background once I had all of the stems down. I could have made the stems a little bit thicker, but in this particular case with just the buds, I didn't want to make them too thick. So I just filled that in with the W3. Next, I'll show you the coloring of all of the leaves because I did color these a little bit differently, but I will speed things up here in a minute. For this first leaf, well, first I did this little stem for this bud, and again, had a little bit of an area where I had to fill in with the W3. But for this large leaf, I'm going to start off by filling in the entire thing with my lightest color, just like I did with the flower petals. And I'm going to do one leaf at a time. Even though these leaves are not touching, it's still easier for me to do one at a time. So I am going to bring in my YG99 as my darkest color, and I'm going to create a shadow where that bud is kind of hanging over the leaf, and this leaf is hanging or kind of tilted off to the left. So my shading is going to be on the left, so it would be on the bottom part of the leaf. And I'm putting a little bit of shading where it's tucked behind that larger flower. And then again, just a little bit on the left-hand side, blending that out with the YG97, then the YG95, and then just leaving that small little highlight area for that YG93. Next, we'll move on to this next leaf over here. And this one actually has veins within the image. But being I use fade out ink, you're not going to see those. So I just completely ignored them, and they'll kind of disappear as I do my coloring. So again, going to color that in with my lightest color. And this time I added a little bit of shading on the base where it's tucked behind those flowers, and then also on the tip. So this leaf will kind of appear as if it's kind of bent or bowed out. Blending that out each time with the two midtones, and then just leaving a very small highlight right in the center of the leaf, and that will kind of give the leaf some movement. Next, I'm going to move on to the stems, or the larger stems, I guess, and these two final leaves. So I'm going to go in again with my lightest color and fill in that entire area, including those two leaves. Then I'm going to go in with my darkest color, and I'm just adding a little bit of shading on the stems underneath where they're attached to the flower, I guess. And then just a little bit off to the left-hand side, and I'm barely touching the paper here. I did make these stems a lot thicker than the image actually is, just because, again, my W markers did not bleed as much as I thought they would. So I can make these as thick or as thin as I want them to. For the first leaf, or the bottom leaf, I added a little bit of shading to I guess it would be the left-hand side of the leaf, but underneath it, because it is kind of tilted down. And for the top leaf, I just added a little bit of shading in the center. Where the stem kind of branches out to that other flower, I did add a little bit of shading where they kind of meet. So it was kind of like a V, just to kind of differentiate between the two portions of the stems. So blending that out each time with my midtones, and then finally back to my lightest color just to add that highlight for basically the top part of that one leaf and the tip of the other leaf. And then going back in with my W markers to go ahead and fill in any gaps that I may have missed, or just that it just didn't blend the way I wanted them to. So I can always fix that. So I wanted to give this even more of a watercolor look. So I'm taking my W5 refill here, which is the darkest warm gray marker that we used. And this is my really lazy masking job. I didn't want to have any splatters on my flowers, so I'm just ripping pieces of full stick Post-it notes here and covering up a majority of my flowers and leaves. I just didn't feel like cutting out this image, and it was just pointless to have to do that. But I'm taking my little cheapy paintbrush again, and again, just splattering this on just like we would with normal watercolor. And then I'll go ahead and remove the masks. This is alcohol ink, guys, so it will dry almost immediately. You do not have to wait to remove your masks like you would if you were doing this with actual watercolor. So I went ahead and removed those immediately, and you can see that I have those splatters all around my image itself. So next, I played around with the sentiment set that I was originally going to use, and the only way to really use it was I was going to have to stamp over a good portion of my image, and I didn't want to do that. I worked way too hard on this card. This card took me quite a bit of time, so I decided to bring out another stamp set, and this is the All About Mom stamp set, also by MFT, and this has smaller sentiments in it that can kind of be carried on their own. And that's what I ultimately decided to do. Mother's Day is coming up, so this will be a good card to have anyway. So I ultimately decided just to have the I Love You Mom instead of that really large mom. Again, I didn't want to cover up too much of my image. Went ahead and popped that onto my acrylic block, and I'm going to go ahead and stamp this on the lower right hand corner, and that way it won't cover up any of my image at all. I'm using black dye ink by Simon Says Stamp. This is a great ink for sentiments. It gives you a crisp image every time and dries immediately, just like a dye ink would. So I'm going to take some Fun Foam, and I'm going to adhere this to the back of my card panel, this time using my ATG gun right on my card panel itself, which was a lot easier than trying to get that onto the foam. And then I will pop this onto an A2 size top folding white note card. And I do put a little bit of adhesive right there in the center of the Fun Foam as well. Otherwise, it kind of bubbles up after a while anyway. So last, I took a few Morning Dew Nuvo drops, which will dry clear, and just popped a few of those around my sentiment. And that is it. I do squeeze that out a little bit on a scrap piece of paper to make sure there's no air bubbles. But that is it. Thanks a lot for stopping by, guys. Have a great day. Bye.